Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Barbara Poppe, and I'm here on behalf of the Framework for an Equitable COVID-19 response to homelessness and the pandemic. We are joining you today, and I've got a great group of folks who are joining me in. This is the second in our series of webinars, so we're really glad to have you to be a part of this. Today, we're going to explore more deeply the policies and practices we have in our toolbox to serve people experiencing homelessness or housing instability, and how you can serve them by mobilizing key housing and homeless resources that's been made available over the past 18 months. Clearly, historic levels of funding are available to communities. Next slide. The organizations behind the framework for an equitable COVID-19 response are noted on the slide. I think you can agree with me, these are some of the top organizations in the country, and I found in working with them over the last year and a half, they are a really amazing group of experts who have a deep passion for our shared work. Next slide. The framework itself was developed in the early stages of the pandemic and has provided the foundation for the work we've done together. It's built on the following 5 key strategies. First, the importance of advancing racial justice and equity. The second is really addressing the highest needs first. And by that, we are most concerned about those who experience homelessness and those who are at the brink of homelessness. We also know that to be successful, we need to grow our partnerships. And in growing those partnerships, that includes people experiencing homelessness and some new non-traditional partners. And of course, our focus is on housing. How do we get people connected into housing? And how do we focus resources for those who are living on our streets and in shelters to quickly access housing? And then finally, I'm going to say quick again. We really need to act quickly. This is an urgent situation. We are seeing in many, many communities that visible and unsheltered homelessness is growing, and there's never been a better time to really mobilize resources toward this end. Next slide. This is the second of 4 webinars. The last was last week, and you can hear that and see the slides from that by going to the link that's being provided to you. You can also know that it's time to register for the upcoming webinar on housing navigation and landlord engagement. It'll be on August 5th, so please join us for that. And then the yet to be decided on is the actual date for our 4th webinar on the importance of aligning services, funding, and resources as you make forward on your housing strategies. And we're thinking about a 5th webinar, so stay tuned. Next slide. So today's agenda is really strong. I'm really excited about the folks who are going to join me on this. We're going to start out with discussing how homelessness is inextricably tied to racial and other inequities. We're going to then explore the equitable continuum of supports for providing prevention and rehousing in your community. And then importantly, we're going to talk about the funding, because without the funding, the prevention and rehousing continuum is just a concept. We'll then offer some real practical examples about how to achieve the greatest impact in your community, and we'll wrap up with some key takeaways and to be able to take your questions. We are asking you to please use the Q&A box to share your questions, and Kevin is going to moderate a discussion at the end. So right now, speaking of Kevin, let's talk about today's presenters. So really excited that Kevin Solarty, who's the Director of Cross-System Initiatives at the Center for Housing Justice at NIS, is joining us. Kevin is a systems and policy analyst with experience focused in youth, family homelessness, affordable housing, child welfare, and domestic violence. And at NIS, Kevin has been supporting cross-system collaboration with child welfare and legal systems, education, health, immigration, and economic development. And he does this under the mantle of being part of the Center for Housing Justice. So we're really fortunate that Kevin is on our team today. Alex Labenz is involved in systems response planning for Lincoln, Nebraska, as the Continuum of Care Planning Administrator at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Center on Children, Families, and the Law. Alex has a strong background in youth and families and has worked through direct service and child welfare, as well as coordinating the planning and implementation of the Nebraska Balance of State youth homelessness demonstration project. And our third expert who's joining us is Tomiquia Moss. She is well known as a dynamic nonprofit and public sector leader in housing, public policy, and community development. Currently, she serves as the founder and CEO of All Home, a new organization dedicated to finding regional solutions to the homelessness and housing crisis in the Bay Area. So with the next slide, I am going to pass the baton to Kevin to kick off the first section of our discussion today.
Great, thank you, Barb. We can go on to the next slide. So this statement is, at this point, should really be no surprise to any of us, right? That there is the direct link between racial disparities and homelessness. And systemic racism and homelessness, and that's really only been amplified during the pandemic, right? And so I think if anything, this pandemic has showed us, right, that there is not necessarily anything new about the faults of where we have in our system, particularly for when we think of Black, Brown, Indigenous folks, but it is just put the spotlight on it. And I think the intersectionality of that, when we think about how that also shows up in health disparities, how it also shows up in low wage work, on people of color being higher rates of frontline and low wage workers, right? All of those things combined, that racial systemic racism across the systems to lead to a higher level of homelessness. We can go ahead and go on to the next slide. So I'm going to root us just in some data, right, in some facts to reiterate what some of those disparities are and look like and have looked like, and particularly, you know, what that means. I think this slide and the next slide together for what might be coming on the cliff as the moratorium ends and we think about what comes next for folks. Black renters experience higher rates of evictions, right? We know that, particularly Black female renters. If you look at this map across 17 states, they have almost double the rate of white renters, right? And so again, maybe in a similar situation of unable to pay rent, but having a much higher rate of actual filing for those evictions. Go to the next slide. So when we look at where folks are and trying to catch up on their rent and avoid homelessness, as again we come to what can really be thought of, I think, as a cliff we're about to come to in this space, renters of color are facing the greatest hardship, right, across the board in catching up on rent. And so when we look at this across Black, Latinx, Asian, we continually see, right, that those renters are often having harder time catching up on the rent. And when we think about that in conjunction with kind of the slide before that and think about how particularly Black renters are more likely to have evictions filed against them in combination with the slower rates of catching up on their rent, those two things again together should give us a lot of concern into how race is going to play into what comes next. Go to the next slide. This last slide, data slide, I think is just a good regrounding in what we know about homelessness in general in this country and the experiences of homelessness in this country. I know this one always sticks out to me as because it really does look at it kind of just from a visual perspective, right? Seeing it from how large the bar is on African American when it comes to homeless population versus the size of it in general population, and really thinking about like what that means, right, in terms of how large that disproportionality is among people experiencing homelessness. And then again, not to just keep reiterating, but when you take the two slides before that and you realize that particularly Black female renters are more likely to get an eviction and they are much more likely to be caught up on their rent, that all puts off to us, I think, a big giant red warning sign of what is to come if we don't strategically use these resources to protect kind of these most vulnerable renters and people experiencing homelessness. So we can go on to the next slide. This is where I want to bring in Tomiquia and Alex to, from a community perspective, to help us think about what some of those disparities you've seen over the past 16 months. And again, I know for folks deep in this work, these disparities aren't necessarily new that you're seeing, but curious on over the past 16 months of the pandemic, kind of what has it brought up or what has it highlighted? What has the pandemic highlighted in terms of what those disparities look like among folks related to homelessness and housing instability? And Alex and Tomiquia, maybe go in any order you want in terms of answering that question.
I have a somewhat quick response to that, and then I'll pass it on to Tomiquia. Like you said, we're not really new to the idea of examining our racial disparities and how we're addressing that as a system. But I think that what jumped out to us the most this past year is that the population of undocumented citizens in our communities probably wasn't included in those conversations as much as it needed to be. So for our system, we really need to make sure that we're looking at the wide range of underrepresented populations.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question, Kevin, and the sort of grounding in the data. And Alex, I think your point is really well taken around our undocumented neighbors needing resources. And frankly, some of the stimulus dollars weren't necessarily targeted to those populations. And so a lot of the local efforts that we saw in the Bay Area and across the state of California were really philanthropic partners and private sector partners coming together to provide funds that could be directly targeted to our undocumented populations and immigrant populations who are not necessarily accessing the public programs. I guess I would say a couple of things that we saw in the last 16 months. One is, as the state stood up its rental assistance program that was really designed to provide rental support for folks through the pandemic who were in arrearage and needed those dollars to stay housed, it was a very rocky start. We saw that it was difficult to access the system equitably. So folks who had barriers to technology, folks who were not necessarily tied into case management support, or even if they were, the system was really difficult to navigate. So I think the state has taken some really important steps to streamline and simplify the process so that our most vulnerable neighbors can actually access it, and those who are advocating on their behalf have access to a more efficient and effective way of getting those dollars into the hands of people that need it the most. I think the other thing we saw was we needed to really work with our local communities on targeted outreach engagement. The outreach was actually not targeted enough, both to our the lowest income households, and to our BIPOC community, the folks who really are not necessarily plugged into the formal homelessness system were not getting access to these resources. So we have been working, All Home has been working with local jurisdictions throughout the region to really think about what is your network of support that includes a culturally relevant and specific outreach strategy to getting deeply into communities where folks who are most impacted are at the table and participating in these programs. So I think that was a really important complement and necessary piece of the larger state program tying to the local rental assistance programs that had a lot more ability to do the deeper targeting on income and specifically targeting census tracts and communities and non-traditional providers, frankly, who were touching residents in our communities who needed to get support. And then the last thing I'd say is, we in California, our eviction moratorium was due to expire in June of 2021. And All Home and many of our partners really fought to have that extended, because we had not seen the dollars get into the hands of the people who need them the most. The state program had only expended about 30% of their resources at the time that the negotiations for the extension started. And we most certainly weren't seeing that deep engagement around outreach, getting deeply into our communities of color. And so I think in combination of barriers, of making sure that we're holding our Black, Brown, and Indigenous neighbors through this process, it was really important for us to do some of these programmatic refinements and making sure that our strategies were lining up to actually keeping people in their homes.
Yeah. Thank you. I feel like there was so many good points in there in terms of things that it's tracking, I would say, across the country to what we're seeing, right? Like that concept of it's not just about the disparity of the people being served, but it's also where the money is going, right? It is not reaching the organizations that therefore reach the people that need to be reached. I feel like this pandemic has put a spotlight on that. Like we've known it. We've known that BIPOC organizations, community organizations aren't accessing this money, but this just highlighted it. And I think it's particularly when you think about your other point around kind of undocumented our undocumented neighbors, and right, the cross section of how both they were hit by the loss of job market based on the types of jobs that folks have, and then their lack of access to the benefits. The other piece I would point out that we're seeing kind of across the board nationally too is putting a spotlight on the inequities, particularly of BIPOC and LGBTQ young people, right? And the ways in which these funds go out, who they go to, and what they're able to fund is often not matching to the living situations or the needs of youth and young adults. Again, a thing that I would say from experience in working in youth homelessness is not anything new, but it highlighted it to a large extent. Everything from like the requirements of how rental assistance needs to go out, things like that, it doesn't match with the way particularly our young people of color and LGBTQ young people actually experience homelessness and experience and need housing assistance in that way. Any other, Alex or Tomiquia, anything else that you would add before we move into the next section?
I guess just to highlight that last point you made, Kevin, around low barrier strategies to getting people resources, right? Like if the paperwork and the process is so onerous that your case manager or your housing provider or your landlord, because in California, we require landlords to actually be a part of the program that allows people to negotiate and stay in their housing. I think simplifying our processes is critical, because if we continue to impose so much bureaucracy on our processes, then we're missing the boat and people are even more at risk. So I really appreciate that point.
Yeah, right. Nothing like a crisis of a pandemic to highlight to you like how slow your bureaucracy is, that people can't wait. Not that people should have been waiting months in a shelter before this, but it just highlighted that they can't, right? For their health and safety, like literally can't be waiting for our process. Yeah. All right. I'll move us over to the next section.
Well, thank you, Kevin, Tomiquia, and Alex for getting us started. We're now going to dive a little more deeply into the smart policies and practices that can be used in local communities for addressing homelessness and housing instability through what we've been calling the prevention and rehousing continuum. Next slide. So this simple graphic is just really intended to remind us all that while there are many, many people living in the United States who are housing insecure, and estimates are that 1 in 4 Americans experiences housing instability, the risk of falling into homelessness is happening to not everyone, and that households who have extreme risk of homelessness are a much smaller subset of the group. And so what we want to be sure that we are focused on is that we make sure those who have the most extreme risk have the easiest and most frequent and consistent access to the services that will help them avoid falling into homelessness. So we want to think about risk profiles. And on the next slide, we have decades, I wanted to say this, we have decades of research along with the more recent impacts that have been documented through the COVID-19 pandemic, that the risk of homelessness correlates with certain household characteristics. And these characteristics, these risks are associated with longstanding inequities. It's not new information, but it is consistent information. So when we look at who has the greatest risk of homelessness, we know that those who are Black, Indigenous, or other people of color have very high rates, along with those who've previously been homeless, whether that is more recently or even as a child. We know that the lower your income is, the greater risk you have of homelessness. And when you're staying in more informal living arrangements, things like people who are having to couch surf or stay with family and friends or moving between those situations and motels, those individuals and families are much more likely to experience homelessness. As noted already, immigrant households and people who communicate in different languages have a much higher rate of homelessness, as well as survivors of domestic, intimate partner, or sexual violence. And when we see who experiences chronic homelessness, we in particular are seeing people with disabilities and disabling conditions. But those individuals at some point were just at risk of homelessness, and we didn't stop them from that trajectory. And then finally, we know because of the inequities that we have in our justice system, those who've had criminal justice engagement or have been evicted, they are far more likely to experience homelessness than those who have not. Next slide. So this graphic is intended to help you kind of match the risk of experiencing homelessness to the type of intervention that's needed. So let's start on the left side here. These are the people who are experiencing homelessness. They can be identified by your street outreach or through emergency shelter. And for these folks, the intervention is rehousing, and that's rehousing through permanent supportive housing, wrapped rehousing, or other housing placements. The next highest risk of homelessness will be those who are knocking on the shelter door or who are applying for crisis services requesting immediate assistance as they expect to become homeless today or tomorrow. Homelessness diversion, that is problem-solving supports with connection to community resources, housing assistance, and/or options for support from family or friends, can help them stave off homelessness and fight greater housing instability. For those who have an imminent risk but are not expected to lose their housing today or tomorrow, we can provide homelessness prevention assistance to help them locate more stable housing or perhaps preserve their existing housing if they are a leaseholder. And for leaseholders who are just at the beginning or currently in the eviction process, they do have some more time to resolve their situation. And eviction prevention will be the intervention that we use in those settings. Next slide. So as our framework team really looked closely at these 4 different types of interventions, we realized at their core that both financial assistance and services are required for the family or individual to resolve their housing crisis. There's not a great difference between the interventions because what we do know is the types and intensity of financial assistance and services will vary by household. And financial assistance for housing obviously includes rent and utility assistance, rental application fees, security or utility deposits, addressing arrearages in bills owed to utilities or to prior landlords, and also dealing with moving costs. Other financial support may also be needed, and that should be brokered or provided when necessary. And certainly, we've heard time and time again about the importance of services to also provide supports, and this is housing problem solving to strengths-based case management, conflict resolution, help negotiating with landlords or finding an apartment, making connections to mainstream resources. And I really want to stress here today the importance of making sure that every person you come in contact with is connected to the American Rescue Plan's child tax benefits and stimulus checks. This is cash in the pocket that is incredibly important to their stability. Of course, other services include family mediation, tenant legal services, and credit repair. So we want to think about the package that we are going to share with the family. Next slide. One of the most groundbreaking practices that's emerged and been refined over the past 10 to 15 years is called housing problem solving. This is when skilled, trained, and flexible staff engage in open-ended exploratory conversations to really talk with the household about their strengths and what their support networks are, and sometimes provide pretty simple solutions by connecting them to a community resource or just giving them the space to kind of think through what their options are. At other times, they do need financial assistance, and sometimes there's some follow-up that's needed. We know that housing problem solving as a practice has been documented to help 20 to 80% of households avoid becoming homeless. Actual results are quite variable across the country, but when applied with fidelity to the model, it has been shown to be effective in every community that practices housing problem solving. We know that housing problem solving can reduce the trauma of homelessness. What I really like about it is it's a way to provide greater agency to the family or the individual to really take control of their lives and not have to enter emergency shelter or unsheltered homelessness. Using housing problem solving should be part of your toolbox. And for homelessness and eviction prevention, we believe this can really help increase your effectiveness and efficiency. Next slide. So this graphic gives you a chance to kind of look across the four components of the continuum, and you can begin to see that while there's a common set of practices, that is using a problem-solving framework with individualized financial assistance and services, when it's applied across the continuum, we have some choices to make. And so when we are constrained by resources, we may need to limit assistance to households who meet certain criteria. And that's what's described in these boxes as the targeting criteria. But when resources are not tightly constrained, we can actually use these targeting criteria to be sure that we are really effectively outreaching and engaging with all households that fit these criteria. When we are not intentional with targeting, what we are most likely to see is that we are going to further exacerbate the underlying disparities. And I think this is something that Tomiquia was getting at, is that when we're not clear on the communities that we're outreaching to and connecting with them, we can expect that those communities are going to be left out of the pandemic response. So as you look across this continuum, we urge you to think through who's eligible, but also think about who do you need to target your outreach and engagement with, and be sure that your program effectively meets those. Next slide. So now I'm going to go back to our experts, Alex and Tomiquia, and I have this question posed to you. With historic levels of federal funding to address housing stability, what steps did your community take to really expand the continuum for rehousing and prevention? Tomiquia or Alex, whoever would like to jump in, please do so.
I'll go ahead and get started. So one of the first resources that we received in our community from pandemic funding was the Esg Cares Act Resources. And at that time, our community was really focused on decongregating our shelters and setting up alternate sites into hotels and motels. And we really wanted to make sure that we were connecting those individuals and families that were being decongregated to rapid rehousing as soon as possible. We did not want them to enter back into the shelter system and remain there longer. So we put the ESG resources into a rapid rehousing program targeted at families. And then for prevention, thinking back to last March and April when everyone was in crisis management mode and the eviction moratorium was just being put in place and we didn't really know how to navigate it, we connected with a lot of our legal aid department and some individuals at the law school to figure out how to get into the courthouse and set up an eviction prevention specialist in the courthouse who was there to help connect families right away as soon as possible.
Yeah, I mean, building off of that, we in the Bay Area, we started organizing a process really at the start of the pandemic to bring together regional stakeholders across the 9 counties in the Bay Area to try to figure out if we could come up with a consensus agenda that looked at how do we respond to the most urgent needs that are happening in our community in the midst of the pandemic, and what would people be willing to come together around, both in resources, advocacy, and policy changes, in order to make an attempt to try to scale some of the interventions that communities have been doing for a very long time, but during the urgency of the pandemic needed to be scaled and elevated. And so we developed a regional action plan that set out a goal to reduce unsheltered homelessness in the 9-county Bay Area by 75% by 2024. And it was a really aggressive goal. And what has been really amazing to see is that it's not just our policymakers who are at the table, it's our folks with lived experience, it's our community-based organization leaders, it's everyone sort of saying, you know what, we have unprecedented resources in our community right now. We need to be courageous in setting a goal that brings our most vulnerable neighbors inside, while simultaneously looking at investments in prevention and permanent housing. So the framework that we developed through that process was really saying, similar to the continuum, Barb, is that we are unwilling to make individual investments in any one of these interventions if we're going to see impact at scale. We actually have to make simultaneous investments both in interim housing, bringing our neighbors inside as quickly as possible in non-congregate settings. And we are agnostic on that type. It can be tiny homes, it can be hotels, motels, whatever that is. And we're seeing a lot of innovation in that space in the Bay Area around interim housing being set up very quickly, modular, 300 units of modular housing in Santa Clara County, for example, being set up in 9 months. To bring neighbors inside so that they were less vulnerable to COVID, but also, reducing the unsheltered homelessness population in their community. So while making an investment in interim housing, we're asking for a simultaneous investment in prevention. In the Bay Area, for every one person that's housed, 2 to 3 people become unhoused during the same period of time. So we can no longer just kind of know that reality and not prioritize investments in prevention. And we have thought about prevention as a continuum, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Very similar, Barb, to what you've articulated in your slides, that we have to meet people where they are and create enough capacity in our system to have resources available for people wherever they are in their housing crisis. And then lastly, our plan really calls for investments in permanent housing. In the Bay Area, like many communities across the country, we have a housing shortage in one of the highest housing markets on the planet. And so how do we ensure that we're not just warehousing folks when they come indoors, but we're moving them through a system that allows them to have permanent exits as quickly as possible? So the framework we call sort of a 1-2-4 framework, and that 1-2-4 is 1 interim housing, 4 investments in prevention, and 2 investments in permanent housing. And that ratio is one that can be modeled against each jurisdiction's community needs. So the ratio is really trying to help jurisdictions understand, what do you need in your system, who's where, and how do you graduate that system to meet the need, and then make sure that we attach the funding, both from the state and from the feds, to that set of priorities. So it's been really exciting to see that we're taking a more holistic approach and building on the excellent work that's been happening in the Bay Area, but trying to accelerate it.
Great, thanks, Tomiquia. Alex, I had a question for you before we move on to the next section. And this was something I think we talked about in our prep for this webinar. Was, early in the pandemic, we were really operating under scarcity. There weren't enough masks for everybody. We certainly didn't have enough resources to do it. But as we've moved through the pandemic and as we got to the spring, it became much clearer that we had to shift from scarcity to abundance and change the models and approaches to it. So Alex, you want to share a little bit about how Lincoln made that shift from scarcity to abundance, and when it became clear to you you could do more?
Yes. So overall, I would echo Tomiquia's comments about the holistic approach and looking at the entire spectrum of housing in our community. And once I keep going back to Mark's comments from last week and talking about how this is hard work and sometimes it's different at different levels. But for the city of Lincoln, we were extremely lucky to get our own allocation of funding for a lot of this programming. So we were able to make these decisions and put these plans into place in a smaller size. So this past spring, when all of the additional funding streams that we're going to break down later started coming out, we looked at the entire spectrum of housing and we talked about how can we move people through the system in a capacity that we are still remembering that we need to match them with the most appropriate services for their needs. We did not want to put people into a program that wasn't going to have any of the case management services that they, I don't know if deserve is the right word, but that they should have access to. We wanted to make sure that we were really meeting the people where they are and where their needs are. So like I said, we expanded with rapid rehousing early on. We've been continuing with that. We're working really hard to stand up our emergency housing vouchers and use that as a move-on strategy so that we're able to put some of our chronic population into the permanent supportive housing programming that we have in the community. And then a lot of work separately being done around the youth population that also was kind of left out, and how we're connecting them with ongoing supports for emergency shelter alternatives that might not, knowing that our youth population is safer in different shelter opportunities. So
great. Thanks, Alex. That's super helpful. Let's move on to the next slide.
Barb, if I could just make a quick point about your scarcity point, because I think it's really important for the audience to understand how difficult it has been for jurisdictions around the country to not operate in a scarcity mentality. We have not had enough resources, frankly, to meet everyone's housing needs in our communities, full stop. And so when we now have an abundance of resources, you actually have to have already thought about your strategies and the planning so you can effectively tie those resources to interventions that are going to move the needle in your community. And I feel like, you know, public policy has required us to do one intervention at a time, to say, you know what, if you're investing in permanent housing, you can't simultaneously invest in prevention. And we're bucking the status quo. And I just think it's a really important point that you've raised and that Alex and her community has actually done, to say, you know what, now is the time to vision for a different future and not have to make these false choices about one needier neighbor or the next. Let's make a more holistic set of investments and strategize for those investments so that we can actually get to the scale of the problem. So I just wanted to put a finer point on that because I think that's important.
Great. Thank you, Tomiquia. That's super helpful. So on this slide, we want to call out 4 really important strategies for reaching the people and the communities that are facing the greatest risk. So the first is really obvious. We got to partner with the people experiencing homelessness, and we got to partner with the residents and the organizations from impacted neighborhoods. These are the experts. You need their wisdom. They are also trusted by the people you want to reach. I just can't overemphasize enough how I'm seeing communities that are doing this and taking it hard are having really strong success in doing this, and they're never going back to sitting in their closed meetings and planning what needs to happen in the community. The second area is be sure that your outreach efforts and your resources are actually reaching these communities. And in particular, they're reaching BIPOC communities. It's not enough to talk about, we intend to reach out to them and they have a chance to reach out to them. But we've actually got to reach out and be on the ground. We got to be knocking on the doors, and we got to establish really direct connections. And if we're not doing that, we're really falling short. We know that BIPOC-led and BIPOC trusted organizations are really able to meet needs. We know that organizations that are led by and serving people with disabilities and serving the LGBT community, that are representative of our immigrant households and survivors of domestic and interpersonal violence, those need to be fully embedded in your outreach and engagement strategies. If you're not sure where these geographies are, there's this great tool that the Urban Institute put together that we're going to talk a little bit about next, but use that to find the places that you really need to be showing up for. And then finally, I just want to encourage you, we are an abundance of emergency rental assistance and other resources. We need to be sure that those resources are really are targeted to the places that have the greatest impacts and risks. And that means partnering with your homeless assistance organizations and the Continuum of Care. Get them to the table if you haven't already done so. They too are experts, and they too are in contact with the populations you're trying to reach. So let's talk about the geography. So next slide. So this slide I put together by just using this really great tool at the Urban Institute. And I pulled the data based on the Continuum of Care. And what you can see is the census tract that I have pulled the data most particularly for has an extremely high need for emergency rental assistance. So this is just one of the census tracts in this community that you need to be really active in. But you can see that it varies greatly across the Continuum of Care. It is not a consistent rental assistance crisis across all of the Lincoln, Nebraska Continuum of Care. Next slide. So for this, I actually pulled Alameda County, and then I zoomed out so I could see the whole region. And I think what you can see here is this particular census tract I pulled, like in Lincoln, has a high need for emergency rental assistance. But you can also see that that is quite different than the rest of the Bay Area. And what I think I take away from this is if you have a peanut butter strategy, you're going to spread the money, it's going to go equally to every zip code, you're going to be really failing at your job because you need to target your resources to the places that are the darkest blue here. Be sure those are the organizations you're partnering with. Be sure that the money is actually flowing there. Don't just have them show up in your plan. Make sure that the resources are actually getting there. So next slide. So the good news is we've got some experts in this. And I'm going to turn this back over to our two local experts and have them take a shot at answering these first two questions. And then I'm going to get Kevin back into it. So Tomiquia, then Alex, you want to take a pass at the first two questions just to get us started in this section?
Sure. Maybe I'll start us off answering the first question. So one of the things that we did was my organization had been looking at prevention before the pandemic and really trying to understand how it fit into the suite of services and options, and frankly, the continuum of housing solutions for people. And so when we began our work, we started looking at what would it be like to have a regional homelessness prevention network, right? Where not just one city or county had prevention services offered to folks, but that there would be a regional network across the 9 counties that had providers that were trained in problem solving. There are one data platform that allowed providers and participants to use the platform to access prevention resources. And so we started a regional homelessness pilot with the city of San Francisco, Oakland, and Fremont here in the Bay Area. And what we wanted to do was really figure out how to braid all of the public resources that were coming into our communities with private resources so that we could begin to distinguish between the deep targeting we needed to do in homelessness prevention, but also making sure that people who were most at risk of homelessness and those who were at risk of anti-displacement and eviction also had support. So we started really looking at infrastructure, like how do we as a community have the right kind of, infrastructure to receive these dollars and then disperse those resources into the hands of the people that need them the most. And so setting up a data platform that can be shared across geographies that allows us to share the same data. We did a very targeted assessment tool that really highlights the risk factors, Barb, that you pointed out earlier in the presentation. Who is most at risk of homelessness, right? Not everyone who is extremely low income is going to experience homelessness. And so we think it's critically important to give our community the tools to understand who's at most risk and then make the difficult decision, because before it was the peanut butter effect. And we were seeing that dollars weren't actually getting in our inflow is higher than our rehousing exits. And so we really thought it was important during this moment to emphasize the targeting necessary, not just on census tracts, but being kind of unafraid to make the racial equity debate around who in fact needs those dollars and where they need to be going. And we are in the midst of this pilot, and our goal over the next 3 years is to expand this prevention network across the whole Bay Area.
All right, I can go ahead and jump in. Is that okay?
Please do.
Okay, I was looking at your so what we did, we absolutely looked at a lot of the same framework that Tomiquia just described. And then so taking it a step further into actual practice, what we did is we've been using the tool from the Urban Institute to look at our neighborhoods and making sure that we're hosting more community events for hands-on help with those applications. A lot of the feedback that we got early on is that there's a lot of barriers and red tape involved in those applications. And there's a lot of documents you have to get to prove income. And that is just one more challenge. And so we made sure that we were on the street in the neighborhoods that we needed to be helping with those applications, helping getting as many people as possible connected. One of the things we also struggled with at the beginning is awareness of the funding. And as you could see from our demographics, is there were areas of our community that have never experienced housing instability before. And they had no idea how to access resources. And so understanding that we want to make sure that we are being able to give all of our most appropriate resources to our population experiencing homelessness, we needed to prevent them from needing those resources. We needed to keep them housed so that we didn't have more housing crisis. So we were able to target those areas as well and make sure that they would help that they knew the program was available and to keep them housed as well. And I think that's it on that topic.
Thanks, Alex. That's super helpful. Kevin, would you want to get in here and just mention any thoughts you have on beyond geographic targeting? What other strategies are important to reduce disparities that we haven't talked about so far?
Yeah, sure. And I think we got at some of them, but it's, I think as you think about that geographic targeting and who is administering the money in that targeting area, it's often still white-led organizations administering it, even in neighborhoods that are historically Black, Brown, Indigenous. And so part of that strategy has to be actually to build the capacity of smaller organizations to receive and administer the money, right? And so there has been a push in several of the communities we're working in to actually everything from the way you procurement, everything from the way you actually get into community and help break down the barriers to applying for the money, So that real focus on not just who you're targeting, but who you're targeting to distribute the money is really important, for access reasons, for all of the reasons, right? And as we talked about earlier, right, the pandemic just like put a highlight on how heavy our bureaucracy is in actually getting that money out. So I think that is that's super important. And I would say even beyond getting the money out, I think like doing the deep level of work among providers, right? So we've seen that in a couple communities. Looking at Tomiquia in San Francisco, some of the work that they're doing to actually like have some real hard conversations around like what it means when the larger, predominantly white-run organizations keep getting the money, and like how as provider to provider what is your responsibility as an organization who believes in race equity to actually call that out to your funder, and what does it mean to potentially lose some of that funding to an organization that is smaller, that is Black, brown led, right? Those are real conversations that I think are even not even so much about the the funder, but have to do with like the provider at the community level. And it's like to me, this is the time to actually lean into the value of race equity and live into that. And we're seeing some kind of large organizations really lean into that and understand that like it's going to mean that their budget goes smaller, so that a budget of an organization that is closer to the people that need to be served. The other thing I would say that we have seen be powerful is like true partnership with people, lived experience, like not to like bring them in to just say like what are your ideas, but actually to bring them into the decision making process, right? And so what does it actually mean to like move decisions on how this money gets awarded away from a small group of individuals that sit around a table and bring it more into like community budgeting processes, right? And what does it mean to start building up the accountability to holding your funders, whether that's the city, the county, the state, to those kind of community budgeting recommendations, right? And that takes time. That takes political organizing, to be honest, right, in order to actually hold folks accountable. But what we've really seen in a couple communities is like a real start to shift to say, we're going to actually be held accountable when you say we think the money should be spent on this, or X percentage actually should go to this. We're actually going to do it, right? Like we're not going to just bring you to the table and ask you what your opinion is, but we're actually going to fund the things that you're asking for, and we're going to keep ourselves held accountable to that. Again, I'm seeing that much more, I would say, at the city and county level at this point. But those are just some of the things I think that go beyond like targeting geographically.
Great. Good stuff, Kevin. Let's shift to the next slide and talk about the money. So in this next session, we're going to talk about all of the federal resources that are out there and the ones you should be focused on. So next slide. I saw in the chat that someone asked the question of, well, how do you convince people that there's an actual abundance of resources? Well, I think if you look at this slide, this is a fairly extensive list of many of the resources that are available. This is not exhaustive, but you can see that there's emergency rental assistance that's available, coronavirus relief funds, ESG and CDBG under the CARES Act. And then under the American Rescue Plan, there's a whole host of resources that are available. And when we map these out against what do we need to solve for prevention and rehousing, you can see from this matrix that these resources for rental and utility assistance are available. Many of the funds can support services, and many of the funds can also be used for other financial assistance. So when you think about abundance in your community, I think one of the really important things to do is to look comprehensively across all of these funding sources and understand how much your community is getting, how much your community is spending, because we're now at a point where we are seeing that communities are not in any way spending down these dollars to scale of what's a amount that has been made available to them. And so creating some transparency and awareness about what your community has available allows you to say, well, if we want a holistic response, we can pick and choose and marry and match and braid and leverage and bring all of these funds together. So really encourage you to learn more about these funds and to capture what's available in your community. So with that, I want to turn to the next slide. And Alex and her community came up with a really great idea. It's more than an idea, they're actually doing it. So Alex, why don't you tell us a little bit about why and how you established the Lincoln Prevention Assistance Common Fund and what exactly that is?
Yes, so we also have always had a dream of a community common fund for prevention. And the idea behind it is kind of similar to the idea of coordinated entry, is that we wanted to make an equitable opportunity for anyone in the community to access the funds anywhere that they are connected to resources. We wanted to get rid of agency hopping for $200 there, $100 here, just to get back paid utilities. We wanted it all in one place. And so with this opportunity of all these funds coming in, we were able to approach our local community foundation, who offered to be our common fund holder and our check cutter. So someone just writing a lot of checks each week, it's a big undertaking when you're putting on a program this size. So we were very thankful for them. And then we were also very thankful that our city leaders were able and willing to put a lot of those resources into this common fund. And so building off of our coordinated entry system and really utilizing our HMIS system for this program, we are able to use the logic of identifying who is eligible for what funding to make sure that we're using each funding source appropriately. And then it also helps us prevent duplication of services on the other side of that. So that's why we did it and how we did it a little bit. And then we also built upon our agencies, knowing that we needed to staff those additionally. I think everyone is probably understanding that our agencies have been so stressed this past year, and they have been asked to do more tasks than ever before. So we wanted to make sure that we were giving them the assistance that they needed to help those, and before they were burnt out themselves. So we staffed additional positions to help with that and not create another job on top of someone else's. So, and then going back just a little bit and keeping in mind our equity and serving our populations through not just in geographic targeting, but one of the challenges of agencies is the red tape and the being scared of HUD programming. There's a lot of there's a lot to do. And if you're a small agency and you're brand new to HUD programming, it can be incredibly intimidating. So we really tried to use partnerships and allow subcontracts for case management for those and for agencies in communities to make sure we're serving all of those populations equitably. And that was part of this as well.
Thanks, Alex. Let's go on to the next slide. So in this slide, these are the 4 largest programs that are available that can be used for prevention and rehousing. And I just want to call out first the emergency rental assistance funds. Those are administered by Treasury. And you would expect that with 1.2 million households facing eviction and the CDC eviction moratorium about to expire, that this $46 billion in funding would be clear out in the pipeline. But the reality is a recent report showed that only a little more than $1.5 billion of the $46 billion had actually been made available to renters. And so there's a great urgency in communities to get those dollars out. And I would say that an underutilized resource here is partnering for the rest of the continuum, using those funds for homelessness prevention, homelessness diversion, and rehousing. It's a tremendous opportunity. The second tranche of funding that's been discussed, I think already, is the CARES Act provided for ESG. Again, this is a historic amount of money, $4 billion. It absolutely dwarfs the much smaller annual ESG program. But what we're seeing is many communities are not actually expending these dollars. In some cases, they haven't even allocated those dollars. This is just a crime because these funds have so many different uses. They can pay for services, they can pay for wrap rehousing, they can help in so many ways. And so now is the time to really step up our advocacy to get the funds reallocated, review who's getting the funds, and be sure they're going out to the households who need them the most. And then this emergency housing vouchers is a brand new resource that comes out of the American Rescue Plan. This is very exciting because for households who get an EHV, it will function much like the housing choice voucher. They can have this for long-term assistance. But for communities, if you don't get these funds out there and under contract, they're going to get reallocated to other communities. So encouraging communities to think really strategically about how you're using those for purposes of rehousing, as well as for those households who are at tremendous risk of falling back into homelessness who've recently exited. And then this $5 billion in the Home Homelessness Assistance Program. This is 4 times the annual appropriation. So again, it's a super large amount of money going out across the country. And it can be used to actually develop and support affordable housing. So we've got a critical supply shortage. You can use your dollars to do that. You can also use these funds to acquire and redevelop the non-congregate hotel shelters that many communities are using during the pandemic. And those can be converted to permanent housing, or you can keep them as a non-congregate shelter environment. You can also provide tenant-based rental assistance if you're unable to use funds through the supply development we just discussed. And they can also, in some cases, be used to provide supportive services. So these are 4 terrific funding sources, and being strategic about how you use them is critically important. So let's talk a little bit about what is happening with these 4 funding streams in the communities of Lincoln and the Bay Area. And Alex, I know we've been getting some questions on rural issues, and you did let me know you work on the balance of state as well across rural Nebraska. So maybe you've got some thoughts on how these funds can be used in rural communities as well.
Yeah, I can absolutely touch on our rural. And as a fellow rural community, I understand how some of these issues get targeted towards urban populations. So I will just say I am so excited about the EHV opportunity. That is going to be such a game changer for our entire continuum of housing. It's really opening up opportunities for us to move people along and bring people in. So one of the challenges with the EHV vouchers is that there are no services attached to them. So we had to figure out how to grade our funding and be able to support those people or in families that are entering those vouchers because we want them to be successful. We don't want them to fail out. And then also understanding that we cannot redistribute that voucher after 2023. So in the best interest of everyone, we wanted to make sure that we were really targeting the most appropriate population for those vouchers. And then we had created like a move on assessment, and we're working through that right now and getting feedback from our providers and our on that. So braiding the funding with that, we are going to use some of the ERA2 flexibility for the housing stabilization funds and provide case management under that program for services. So that's a really exciting opportunity. From the rural perspective, we are underneath the state for our rural population, our rural communities. And so that is a lot slower to roll out. So we had to go into the programming without the services attached. And so we really worked with our local communities and providers in those areas to figure out who was able to provide like ongoing case management under like our traditional ESG programming, or if they did have funds left over from the ESGCV that they haven't been able to spend, how can we use those resources to help them with that? So.
Great strategies, Alex. Tomiquia, you want to jump in?
Sure. In this area, I think what's been most helpful to see is jurisdictions combining their local self-help measures with the federal funding. So a lot of our communities passed, county or city measures to increase their housing production for formerly homeless folks and or services. And so now that we have additional resources coming in the various pots that you just articulated, it allows local jurisdictions to bring the federal dollars into their community and braid those funds with their local dollars so that it enhances the full suite of production goals that folks have, the prevention goals that folks have. And so it's been really great to see home dollars, for example, being leveraged in communities where they had a pipeline but had run out of money. And now the dollars can be distributed to increase production for extremely low income households in the region. I think another place we saw some creativity was around using our private and philanthropic dollars with the federal rental assistance program. So the federal dollars were actually going to financial assistance to the households, but the private dollars we've been using to do some of the work Kevin described, which is bringing more non-traditional Black and Brown led organizations into the fold of getting outreach services to that deep targeting services. So we've been providing grants to those organizations to build capacity within those smaller organizations to be able to provide resources and connectivity to the bigger programs for their communities. And so those have been some strategies that we've seen in terms of leveraging the broader funding pot. I think the last thing I'd say is we have established a housing and financing authority for the Bay Area that I think will allow, it allows us to do ballot measures for funding of deeply affordable housing for formerly homeless folks and extremely low income households. And I think having the federal funding come into communities and move the needle on bringing our neighbors inside will give way, I think, for the public to really support a regional or statewide ballot measure to have ongoing permanent funding for these, because we have to also recognize that a lot of the resources that are in our communities right now are time limited. And so if we're going to have an ongoing funding source that supports jurisdictions across the state to really tackle homelessness and housing insecurity for the long term, we need to be planning for those ongoing funding sources.
Great. Thanks, Tomiquia. Next slide, please. If you want to learn more about the funding streams, we did a webinar on this last week. The slides and the recording of the webinar are posted. We encourage you to look at those resources as well as this special resource that we made available. Next slide. There's also more information available from the government offices that administer these funds. We encourage you to take a look at those as you plan your opportunities for braiding and leveraging funding to meet needs in your community holistically. Next slide. So this is about our final section here, and we're just a little behind my planned agenda, but we're doing great. So let's keep it rolling here. So right now we're going to talk about how you can have the biggest impact in your community. And let's start with the next slide. I am a rural girl at heart, having grown up in rural Ohio. And so I'm always happy to be the one that gets to talk about rural communities. So as you look at this scenario, what we want to emphasize here is the first thing you need to do is to understand your community and what the needs are, because the needs in every community are somewhat different. There are some key trends that are the same, but you want to look specifically, what does your community need? And so for this example, which is a balance of state in a Midwest, it's actually, I think, the state of Indiana. And what you can see here is that this state has a relatively large number of sheltered and unsheltered people, but higher sheltered than unsheltered. So they also have available rental stock, because you can see their rental vacancy rate is about 9%, but the number of extremely low income renters with severe cost burden, that's paying more than half of their income for rent, is extremely high. 3/4 are severely cost burdened. And so that's kind of the dynamics. And yes, also the units available. For every 100 households who need units, only 37 have access to them. So there's a real disparities in what the needs are compared to the resources. So the strategies that are recommended on the next slide look at, first of all, is to focus most of the resources on rehousing households from shelter, because that's the largest population, and to set an actual numeric goal that can be achieved with the resources that are available. And because it's a rural community, it's really important to scale these regionally, and rapid rehousing is a very effective tool in rural communities. The funding sources for this can be the Esg Cares Act money, the new home under American Rescue Plan can be used for tenant-based rental assistance, and also EHV, those emergency housing vouchers. And we believe this is possible to do because, as we said, the supply in many cases with subsidy is going to be available compared to some other communities. The second strategy is really to focus on diverting households and prevent homelessness. So the goal established here is to divert 200 households using these funds and to prevent homelessness for 300 households. To do this, you can do master lease of interim crisis units. You could scale or implement a sub-regional diversion or homeless prevention, and conduct outreach to the highest need areas. Because even in rural communities, the needs can be quite concentrated, and it's important to be reaching out into those neighborhoods and communities. The funds you can use for this are the ESG coronavirus, the Treasury's emergency rental assistance, and then other resources. So this is just an example of how you can establish some goals, a set of actions that could be undertaken, and then using different funding sources to make this possible. So that's our example for rural and balance of states. I want to pass it off to Alex to talk a little bit about their strategies in Lincoln.
Okay. There we are. Okay. We have a very low unsheltered population, just due to our capacity of the size of our city population. So like I said before, earlier on in the presentation, we worked really hard to decongregate our shelters for safety, and to move those into hotel motels and continue to get them rapidly rehoused with those ESG dollars. Could I actually get the next slide? Thank you. So these were our goals and priorities for the past year. And then mentioned before, we created the Common Fund Assistance Program to do that. Eviction court. I have seen in the chat asking some questions about how to use the ESG for category 2 under prevention. And I know that the eviction moratorium has made that really difficult. So what we've tried to do is encourage a lot of our rapid rehousing programs that would normally be trying to serve, or our prevention programs that would normally try to serve that category 2 population, to help them apply for the ERA funding, rental assistance for now. And then we really worked on increasing our rapid rehousing availability. We recently put together our home fund plan and sent that up to the mayor's office at Lincoln, and she luckily she approved it. So we're going to be able to move forward with rehabbing hopefully 21 units for permanent supportive housing for our highest users of the emergency use system. And then with ERA2, we are about at 55% utilized spent for ERA1. So we're trying to be really strategic with our planning for ERA2 opportunities. And like I mentioned before, using some of the housing stability differences with ERA2 and how can we fund services with that. And then knowing that we still have funding available for the rental and utility assistance. And then we've also been working really hard to do continued outreach to past clients of rapid rehousing, knowing that they are likely at risk of being behind in rent, and making sure that they are getting the assistance that they need to get through those applications. So that's a brief summary, trying to keep on time. So I'll pass it over to Mika.
All right, I think we can go to the next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, we have set a pretty audacious goal of a 75% reduction in our unsheltered homelessness crisis in the next 3 years. And just wanted to reiterate your point, Barb, around making a numeric goal. I think it's really important for jurisdictions to think about what that goal is for their community so that you know what you're working toward. I feel like in the Bay Area and frankly in the state of California, we have had a very, our homelessness systems approach has been one of maintenance, not of solving and ending homelessness. And so I think this is sort of our stake in the ground to say we believe that homelessness is solvable in the Bay Area, even though it has been an intractable problem and entrenched in many communities across the Bay. But that in order to do that, we need to understand what exactly who we're targeting and how. And so the reasons behind this is really thinking about how do we address that inflow challenge for all of the work that communities are doing on the ground to rehouse people. We actually know how to do this. We do it well. We see it with our neighbors to the south in Los Angeles, who rehouses thousands and thousands of people a month. And yet the inflows into homelessness are so significant that it appears to the public that we're not doing enough to support our neighbors. And so we think it's really important to think about scale of impact and targeting, and then putting those resources directly to those communities that need them the most. And the other piece I'd highlight here on this slide is just figuring out how to get now that we have this sort of regional strategy, we're trying to work with our state partners to say, look, if y'all are administering the resources into communities by county and or direct allocations like Lincoln has, Oakland has direct allocations from federal dollars, right? It's not enough just to do a racial equity analysis to understand the racial disparities. It's then that you have to tie those, once you know what the analysis and the disparities are, how are you actually going to reduce them? So I think that's the next step of advocacy for us, is to help the state think about how to encourage jurisdictions and incentivize jurisdictions to really reduce racial disparities within their community. Step one is certainly identifying what they are, but step two is being able to do something about them in your programming and your resource allocation. And then lastly is this network I was describing earlier. I think Alex talked about this, you talked about it, Barb, in terms of rural housing and prevention supports. Regional collaboration and alignment is critically important. No one jurisdiction can do this work by itself. No one sector or partner can do it alone. And so we really think that figuring out what regional collaboration looks like in your jurisdiction, whether that's within your counties, whether it's cross-county partnerships or what that looks like in terms of public-private partnerships, but how do we think about this as a broader ecosystem if we're going to see some real gains in the work? And then the next slide too. So I won't spend too much time on this, Barb, because I think you've laid out the continuum really beautifully. But I will say one of the hurdles that we're trying to overcome in the Bay Area is, again, not having communities make these false choices of those who are most needy, because, there are lots of needs. People who are facing eviction are absolutely in need of support. And we want to make sure that we get a mutual benefit of targeting resources around homelessness prevention and diversion that actually is more on the front end of the system. And so this is just, again, a different visualization of what you've already shared with our audience around what the end goal is for the Bay Area, is to be able to have a continuum of support for when a person experiences a housing crisis in our region, that there's no closed door to them, but that we've done the homework on the front end of making sure who should be prioritized, who in fact needs that deep targeting and engagement at the community level to make sure that the resources are actually available to the right people. And then how do we make sure that our eviction prevention and anti-displacement work continues? So that's what this slide is articulating. And I'll pass it on back.
Thank you. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to get some time for some questions. So I want to quickly go through the next slide, which is our key takeaways. We've got 3 main points. First, we're encouraging every community to be sure you fully scaled your homelessness diversion and rehousing as you are investing in your homelessness prevention. And be sure to partner with people who have lived expertise, and also ensure that the lowest income households with the greatest housing insecurity are prioritized and served. Not just prioritized, but actually served. So next slide. We have a range of resources that are available. This is a list of them. I encourage you to become familiar with them. They also include links to other resources, and hopefully this will help your community better respond. Next slide. I want to promote, there are questions in the Q&A in the chat box about landlord engagement. That is our next webinar. I encourage you to sign up for that. It's on August 5th. It's going to talk both about housing navigation and landlord engagement. And then we'll have an additional webinar sometime in August that will talk about how you can align services and cover those services that you're not able to cover with your housing funds. So next slide. Whew, we're on to questions. And we've got about 10 minutes here, and I'm going to turn it over to Kevin, who has been paying attention with Kim to the Q&A in the chat box, and let him ask some questions.
Sure. So I think one of the more popular questions was really this idea of moving from scarcity to abundance, and wondering if folks can talk about, from a cultural shift, from a funder shift, from an agency shift, what are some strategies or thoughts that you all have on, like, how do we start shifting our system in that thinking from away from scarcity towards abundance?
Well, I'll just jump in here. I think the first thing is to actually state out loud that we have an abundance of resources that if we don't get them out to people that are in need, they're going to go back to the federal government. So really being clear that there is an abundance of resources is absolutely the first step. I think the second step then is to say, in an abundance, what are the things that we know we should be funding that we aren't currently funding, and how do we come together and do that, and really press on the principles that we've laid out. Tomiquia or Alex, you may have some other thoughts you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we see with our partner organizations on the ground is that even though there are now an abundance of resources, there is not an abundance of infrastructure and capacity to deal with moving these resources through their systems effectively. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is figure out, okay, where are the ways that we can quickly build up staffing capacity, where we can get best practices in place, where we can know what folks' plans are to actually deal with the crisis on hand, so that you're maximizing the resources that are in your community as well. So we have a clock, because they'll go back to the federal government, but we also don't want to be ineffective with their sort of potency and impact. And so I think that's the balance that we're trying to raise, which is because when you've lived in a scarcity mentality forever, it not only is a mind shift necessary, but then how do you actually live in abundance? And I think that's the tension in doing that quickly and then preparing for talent. You know, how do we keep our case managers and our frontline workers who have already been taxed through the pandemic to do more? And money is not always the only driver. So I think creating that sort of organizational infrastructure for our ecosystem to be abundant allows for effective implementation.
I completely agree. It is a huge cultural shift from the world that we previously lived in. It's sometimes we're like, wait, we have more money. Where is this coming? Like, what are we going to do? So we've had to work really hard with our local, like our on the ground providers, because they previously were going into their flex funds and saying, this landlord's going to evict my person next week, that we need to get their rent paid. This landlord's threatening this. But we're able now to remind them, hey, stop. There's an eviction moratorium. Use the tools that you have and breaking it down for them, saying, you know, and that's why where we put that specialist in the courthouse and they have access to our HMIS system, they can go in and see this person has applied for this programming. What we're waiting on is the landlord to sign off that the lease is accurate. And then the judge looks at it and says, oh, well, you need to, if you're evicting them because of financial reasons and you haven't followed up with this program, then no, like we're not going through with it. And so and then reminding our frontline staff that don't tap into your flex funds right now if those resources are available. And I know that it is so hard to say that when someone is sitting in your office or you are meeting them at their residence and they are in crisis mode, and you want to help them. You don't want them to have to go through this stress. But then that is where we need to use next week, you know, that landlord engagement and say, your check is coming in 2 weeks. Like, we need this A, B, and C from you, and then we will get it done. Like, you will have it. And as many times as possible, let's do that. So it's a huge mind shift that we haven't quite gotten over yet, but
takes time, right? Well, I love the idea. It's both a mind shift and an infrastructure building, right? Like both from we have to be advocating from our public funders, but also our private funders to actually be building that infrastructure to get the money out the door. So I know we don't have too much time, but I think we probably have time for one more. So another one that kind of came up in different ways is really kind of what folks, what our presenters' thoughts are on kind of more of the advocacy strategy side around, these are great strategies. They're based in race equity, and what you do when the funder, being a public funder or private, doesn't actually align with these strategies. Thoughts on how you actually push for these types of strategies, particularly like race equity strategies, when your funding source doesn't necessarily align.
I will just go very quickly. I'm sure Tomiquia has a lot of more input, but I live by the strategy of I keep bringing it up and keep asking until they're willing to listen. So just keep, like, even if it's exhausting, you've had the conversation 4 times, go back for time number 5 and keep pushing.
Absolutely. I just would add, it is really helpful to have non-traditional allies in the push for these equity, for an equity agenda. It's not just about the people most impacted. The entire community is impacted when we fail to provide racial justice and housing justice to our most vulnerable residents. And so it is really helpful when you have tenant advocates, when you have housing providers, when you have education leaders, when you have philanthropic and faith-based leaders all coming together to recognize the importance of some of these policies and interventions. And so I think it's super helpful to have strategies at all levels of government pushing an advocacy agenda that says, you know what, our community matters. And as Alex said, we're going to keep showing up and we're going to come up in force so that people can really understand that this is a representation of the voice of the community.
Thank you. Powerful way to close that. I'll turn it back to you, Barb, to close us out.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Tomiquia. Thank you, Alex. You guys are just amazing. It was great to spend the afternoon with you. I also want to thank Kim and the folks at the coalition who've made this webinar possible, as well as all of my colleagues through the Framework for an Equitable COVID-19 Homelessness Response. Hope to see all of you in real life over the course of the next few months as we get hopefully back into it. But in the meantime, please keep showing up here, keep showing up in your communities, and keep doing the really amazing, great work that you're doing on the community at the community level. So thank you all and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.